Hi everyone, we're here this afternoon to go over a few questions that came up on the chat in our pre-series event the other night on the Ukraine crisis, where to from here, and I'm here with Joe Camilleri, and we were very keen to have some of those questions in the chat addressed, if only briefly. Yes. So let me begin with some questions that emerged on the chat concerning the background with Ukraine, the situation with Ukraine, a subject you were only able to give very little attention to, given the time constraints.
Yes.
One question that came up was, has Ukraine been offered or presented with a membership action plan from NATO?
The question of Ukraine NATO membership has been under discussion between the Ukraine and NATO for the best part of 14 or more years, possibly longer. And the Ukraine government, particularly in recent times, has been pushing for membership and asking for an MAP, membership action plan. And now, the NATO leadership, which really is shaped to a great extent by the United States, but with some Eastern European countries pushing for NATO to be given a membership action plan, that is to say, a plan that would eventually lead to formal membership. Up to this point in time, NATO was gradually getting closer and closer and closer to saying, here is your membership action plan. Mm-hmm. And that's the point at which Russia said, this is a red line.
Right.
You offer the Ukraine a pathway to membership. That to us is unacceptable, because it is their lines right on our border. So it is possible to suggest that within another 12, 18 months, something like that, there would have been a very good chance of the Ukraine being formally offered a membership action plan by NATO. Right. And you could argue Putin, rightly or wrongly, decided he would get in beforehand.
Right, right. Okay, so staying with the Ukraine, there were a couple of questions which wanted to expand a little bit on the political background in Ukraine, maybe going back some years. So it was reported, at least in the Western media, that Zelensky came to power with about 70% of the vote on a pro-Western platform. But your remarks the other evening suggested that the situation in the Ukraine is rather more complex than this picture might suggest. So some people were wondering whether you could expand on your brief remarks the other night. And there was just the hint of a suggestion that the democratic process might even have been compromised. It's not something you said, but certainly one sensed that there were issues and goings on in the Ukraine that perhaps we should know a little more about. So I wonder if you could say a few words about this.
Well, the first thing to say is that since independence, some 30 years ago, following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the former Soviet Union, in these 30 or so years of independence, the political situation in the Ukraine, within the Ukraine, has been a tortured one. Right. There have been short-lived presidencies. There have been endless accusations, scandals of corruption, accusations of corruption, scandals, etc. So one leader has come after the other in highly unusual circumstances. Some have been removed following protests. There have been at least two leaders who were, if not fully supportive of the Russian position, were at least open to hearing what Russia wanted to say and was demanding. And both had their position, their leadership positions prematurely ended as a result of protests, shift in the parliament, and so on. Now, it is true that Zelensky proved to be a popular figure in the last election and secured a very high proportion of the vote. But it is also worth stating that many thought that he came with a sympathetic mind towards the Russian position. So a lot of people did not see him at all as a stooge of the West. But as time went on, for a variety of reasons, some external and some internal to the Ukraine, it's clear that the government over which he presides veered more and more to a pro-NATO position and pushing harder and harder for membership of NATO. So now the internal situation is obscure, it's opaque, but it's clear that when it comes to armed attacks against the Russian minority in the Ukraine as a whole, including in those parts of Ukraine which are mainly Russian-speaking, that there have been quite a lot of strikes by armed groups, and that the government, for whatever reason, has at best turned a blind eye to them, perhaps even made use of them to buttress its position. So it has become, I think, a very complex situation, and the nationalist, perhaps even extreme nationalists, but certainly the nationalist elements, though they remain probably a minority, nevertheless are very well organized, wield a lot of influence, and one must assume have become increasingly influential in thinking Zelensky's approach to the entire Ukrainian question. But it is true, he was always, at first, seemingly open to listening to what the Russian position might be. And perhaps his most recent, right now, 4 weeks after the invasion, or as the Russians call it, the special military operation, he's now saying, neutrality, no problem, can discuss it.
But he wasn't saying that.
Absolutely not. He was pushing and pushing and pushing for the membership action plan as the pre-step to full membership.
And that also wasn't glaringly obvious when he first came to power, that he would be pushing for NATO.
Not obvious at all, but it has become increasingly obvious. Right. So that is a fascinating question. So I can't answer the question. Now, Zelensky saying neutrality, no problem, it's negotiable. Is that the real Zelensky? Or is the previous position only a few months old? NATO membership at all costs. Let's have the membership action plan as quickly as possible. We've been waiting too long. Which is the real Zelensky? I can't tell.
Okay, ponder that one. Another question that came, so let me now shift. We've been looking at the background in Ukraine now. Let's focus our gaze on the present. One of the things you were very strong on the other evening was an immediate call for ceasefire. Would you attach any conditions for that? And we're thinking here, or the person posing the question was at least thinking about the nations who are currently engaged in sanctions.
Yes. No, I think that would come later as part of, if you remember, I suggested a kind of 6-step, each step becoming more ambitious in terms of what it was aiming to do.
Yes.
So for this initial first step, which is crucial, stopping the fighting and the killing and the displacement. We've got to get a ceasefire going as quickly as is possible. And to do that, as few preconditions as possible. So all I've suggested is a ceasefire with no condition except one, that the Ukrainian side agree to have a serious discussion, negotiation with the Russian side about the issues which have been of great concern to the Russian side.
And from memory, there were 3. We don't have to repeat them. We can recommend people go back to the recording.
That's right.
The first of which was question of neutrality. Yes.
And it appears that at least on paper, or at least as we hear Zelensky speak, there is some movement, considerable movement on the part of Ukraine towards that. But once those three areas are agreed to as major discussion points for a negotiation post-ceasefire, then I think that's enough by way of conditions for the ceasefire to take effect.
Right. And just leading on from that.
I did say one other little thing about the ceasefire. It would be preferable, but not absolutely a condition that it be UN monitored.
Yes. Okay. Do you see any positive steps the two nations are taking at present?
Well, there have been two positive steps, in my view. Possibly the most important positive step is that virtually all through this period of fighting, discussions have been taking place,
right?
Either online or physically.
Yes.
Very difficult, and often both sides pouring cold water on whether anything that was constructive came out of those discussions. But they're continuing, and this is Tuesday, the 29th, and they are meeting now, going to meet in Turkey. So that process is positive.
Yes.
The fact that they both understand that discussions have to take place, both for the ceasefire and some ongoing coming to some kind of agreement over time.
Yes.
So that's positive. The other thing that's positive, which Western media have interpreted as weakness on the part of the Russian side, is that Russia has not seen fit to literally occupy Ukraine.
Yes.
And I think as a matter of policy, it has stayed clear of directly taking either Kiev, Kharkiv, or some other cities, with the possible exception of Mariupol.
Mm-hmm.
So that is positive. Whether it's been done for altruistic reasons or whether it's done for geopolitics, the fact is it is positive that that has happened. And the fact that they're now saying that their primary focus for the special military operation is the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, which go beyond the areas fully in control of Russian separatist forces, is itself, I think, a positive development, at least in the last week or so.
Yes. Well, this leads to the last question, or perhaps but one. Someone did ask, I think quite fairly, let's take the analysis you gave us last night, and it certainly was enlightening to myself and to many of us who had been getting our information largely from Western media sources. But let's take that. But why attack Ukraine was the question, and in particularly targeting innocent civilians? That was the question.
Well, the why really presupposes, I think, two different questions which need to be separated. If the why is asking, was it justified? My own personal view, and just my view, is that force is very rare. Use of force on a large scale is ever really justified. And in my view, it was not justified in this case because of the suffering that it was bound to cause and has caused. But if you said, what were the reasons? Why did Putin and the people around him decide on such a course of action? Not was it justified or was it not, but why did they do it? Because they concluded, rightly or wrongly, that this military operation, which required the invasion by Russian forces into Ukraine, was the only way they could think of stopping Ukraine along the road to NATO membership and ensuring that Ukraine did not become a base for NATO-type military deployments. And thirdly, that the Russian minority in Ukraine, that their interests and aspirations were fully secure. I think they decided that was what needed to be done for these objectives to be secured, and probably they wanted to establish a larger idea that the notion that the United States could triumphantly keep encroaching on the areas adjacent to Russia, as they have done for some period of time, that would stop.
It would not go unmet with.
It would be met.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's basically what has occurred. And as I said, rightly or wrongly, they're the judgments that I think they've made.
Yes, sure. Thank you for that. I think we've exhausted the questions. I've put them in some sort of condensed form. There is one last question I might ask, and I know you can only be brief. Yeah, a number of us were very interested to hear your 6-stage plan out. This is going to be very difficult to enact. Is it not wishful thinking? How would one go about actually implementing such an ambitious but very important series of steps? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think in my discussion of the 6 points, I probably gave too much emphasis on the role of governments, but governments that have a vested interest in seeing progress, if not along the detail that I've proposed, but some progress, at least the first 2 steps, which would be ceasefire and then withdrawal of Russian forces with some at least preliminary agreement or set of agreements. There are many governments that are fully supportive of that position. And China, for example, and others that I'll mention, are running the line at the moment that they're in the forefront of pushing for exactly this process, at least the first 2 steps that I've been talking about. And they are in discussions with the likes of South Africa, Indonesia, Algeria, and many other countries that feel they don't want to be boxed in fully into one camp or even to the other camp. So I think that's a precious resource that can help us towards that position. So, and I mentioned some other governments, particularly on the Western side. The best option we have is, at the moment, France, because of the intense discussions that have taken place with both the Ukraine and with Russia over the last several weeks, and that's continuing. And it'll be interesting to see how that is impacted by the coming French presidential election, which is barely 2 weeks away. Yes. 2 weeks away. So that, so we can try and identify governments which have placed themselves in a position to make a constructive contribution, and that would be very important, very helpful. I didn't talk so much about 2 other areas. I think the UN, particularly through the offices of the UN Secretary General, could also play an important role, and perhaps some other regional institutions could play a more important role than they have so far, including in Europe, which is a bit difficult at the moment, but also, let's say, the African Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, etc., can all make a useful contribution. So governments, international institutions, regional and global, and thirdly, the concerned public across the world.
Yes.
The concerned public engaging in conversation in every way conceivable, the spoken word, the written word, online, in person, etc., thinking through and advocating something along the kind of process I have outlined, and as we've already seen, some of the initial steps at least have been flagged by others, including governments. And that will require action what some people refer to as action, including public demonstrations calling for such a process to get off the ground, and hopefully then to see a shift in the public narrative, in the media narrative, that points in that direction and that applies increasing pressure. And then it would be up to a whole lot of groups and organizations, unions, churches, humanitarian organizations, etc., to all come to play their part in pushing towards this process and doing it not only within countries, but across countries through increasing international networking.
Sure.
That's the thought, that's the hope. Let's say that at least some of that can come to pass.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I hope this has been helpful for those of you who attended the other evening and has answered some of those leftover questions. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. The discussions is a long way to go.
Sure.
Obviously.